Just after dawn on September 8, 1781, a party of British soldiers was sent out from a camp on the high ground at Eutaw Springs, South Carolina, to dig sweet potatoes. They carried baskets, not muskets. Supplies coming up from Charleston had been strangled for weeks, and a camp of close to 2,000 men had to eat, so the morning's most urgent mission was a vegetable patch. It was the kind of quiet chore that told everyone the enemy was somewhere far off. The enemy was about to walk straight into them. Coming up the river road, screened by the trees, were roughly 2,200 Continentals and militia under a commander the sweet potato diggers never expected to see this far south. By the time British Major John Coffin rode out to investigate the noise, the far-off army was already forming into lines of battle. Hold on to one thing before the shooting starts, because it explains everything about how this day ended. The Americans were going to lose this battle. Their commander would leave the field by nightfall, the British would sleep on the ground they'd fought over, and every dispatch to London would call it a royal victory. And within a matter of weeks, that victory would help hand Britain the loss of the entire Carolina interior. This is the story of how an army lost a battle and won a war on the same afternoon. To understand why, you have to remember how badly the American cause was doing in the South. The year before, in May of 1780, the port of Charleston had fallen, and more than 5,000 American troops had been marched into captivity in a single surrender. The worst American defeat of the entire war. That August, a second army under Horatio Gates had been shattered at Camden, its general galloping off the field and not stopping for days. In the space of one summer, the South had lost two armies. On paper, the region was Britain's. The man sent to rebuild from that wreckage was Nathanael Greene. Pay attention to who he was, because nothing about him predicted this. He was a Rhode Island foundry owner with a stiff, dragging leg that had made him self-conscious his whole life. He was a Quaker, a member of a pacifist faith, who had been formally disowned by his meeting for the crime of attending military parades. He had never commanded an army in a pitched battle before Washington handed him the ruins of the Southern War effort late in 1780. What he had done was read. He had taught himself the science of war out of books bought by the armful in Boston. And he had spent years as the Army's quartermaster, the man who understood better than anyone that soldiers are beaten by empty stomachs and worn-out shoes long before they're beaten by bayonets. And that knowledge was the only advantage he had, because the army Washington handed him was barely an army at all. When Greene rode south to take command at the end of 1780, he inherited a few thousand men on paper and far fewer who could actually stand in the line. A force with no pay, almost no supplies, and in many cases no shoes at all, an army that never had enough of anything and knew it. He spent that winter begging for provisions, rebuilding from nothing, holding a starving command together by sheer will. Remember that, because it explains something that's about to happen on the battlefield. These were men who had gone without for so long that when temptation finally sat in front of them, unguarded, it would cost them everything. Across the field, Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Stewart was everything Greene was not. A professional Scottish officer of the line, careful and competent, commanding his own hardened regiment, the 3rd Foot, the Old Buffs. Where Greene was a self-taught amateur who'd talked his way up from a forge, Stewart was the finished product of the most professional army on earth. And here is the quiet unfairness of history. We know Greene's face, his limp, his Quaker exile, the books he read by candlelight, and we know almost nothing about the man who actually won the day at Eutaw Springs. Stewart left barely a fingerprint on the record. He had only just inherited this command that summer, taking over an exhausted force when the ailing Lord Rawdon sailed home for England, and he was handed a war that had already begun to rot out from underneath him. His supply road up from Charleston was a gauntlet of militia and partisans who cut it apart faster than he could clear it. His men were sick, hungry, and reduced to rooting in the dirt for food, which is exactly why a fatigue party was out digging potatoes when Greene arrived. Stewart was neither a fool nor a coward. He was a good soldier holding an impossible position, and he was about to fight one of the most stubborn battles of the entire war and still walk away from it as the man who lost the interior. That was the trap Greene had built without building anything at all. Not a hidden battalion, not a clever ambush, just a simple, brutal arithmetic that Stewart couldn't escape no matter how the day went, an arithmetic Greene had been perfecting across an entire campaign of battles that looked, one after another, like defeats. Greene did something that, on its face, looked like a death wish. For nearly a year, his entire method had been to not do this. He had marched the British ragged across the Carolinas, fighting and slipping away, never letting his fragile army be pinned into the kind of decisive stand-up battle that had annihilated Gates at Camden. Now, in front of Stewart's professionals, he was choosing exactly that fight, a frontal, open-field engagement with an army that was still half composed of militia, the same unreliable amateurs who had famously thrown down their guns and run at Camden. Everything in his own hard experience said this was the mistake he'd spent a year avoiding. Except he wasn't fighting to win the field, he was fighting to wreck an army, and he had a specific blueprint for doing it, one he had watched work with terrible precision 8 months earlier. At Cowpens in January, his subordinate, Daniel Morgan, had taken the same weakness everyone mocked, militia who wouldn't stand, and turned it into the plan itself. Don't ask the amateurs to hold. Ask them for 2 or 3 good volleys, let them fire into the oncoming British at close range, and then let them run on purpose, straight back through a second line of hardened regulars waiting to finish the job. Greene took that blueprint to Eutaw Springs, almost intact. Picture how he set the pieces. Across the road, in a long first line, he placed the militia, North and South Carolina men, under commanders whose names the British had learned to dread. Francis Marion, the swamp partisan, and Andrew Pickens among them. Behind them, hidden in the timber as a second line, stood the real hammer. Brigades of Continental regulars from North Carolina, Virginia, and Maryland, veterans who had learned to use the bayonet. On the far flanks rode the Legion cavalry and light infantry of Henry Lee, and held back out of sight in reserve, waited Greene's sharpest edge. The cavalry of William Washington and the Delaware Continentals kept fresh for the moment the British line finally cracked. Stewart, for his part, was no amateur either, and he formed his line the way a professional does, his British regulars and his loyalist provincials, the American Tories under John Harris Cruger, drawn up in the woods, straddling the road. But 2 features of that ground are going to matter more than anything else, so fix them in your mind now. The first was a large 2-story brick house sitting near the British camp, solid, thick-walled, the kind of building that could turn a retreat into a fortress in about 10 minutes. The second was on the British right, down by Eutaw Creek, a dense, almost impassable thicket of blackberry brambles, and posted inside it a battalion under a major named John Margery Banks. Remember that thicket, and remember that house. Greene's plan accounted for the open field, for the British line, for the militia's volleys, and the Continental bayonet charge that would follow. It was a plan good enough to nearly destroy Stewart's army in the first hour. What it could not fully account for was a hedge of thorns full of stubborn men, and a brick building waiting to swallow a beaten army whole. Those 2 pieces of terrain were the difference between the American victory that almost happened and the British victory that actually did. For all his professionalism, Stewart had made one dangerous assumption, the same one the sweet potato party had been built on. He believed Greene was still far away. Before first light, 2 deserters had crept into his camp with a warning that the entire American army was on the road and closing fast. But Stewart had heard alarms like that all summer, in a country where every farmer seemed to be an informer and the reports were maddeningly vague about numbers. He sent Coffin's horsemen out to see for themselves. Coffin came back at a gallop with the American vanguard on his heels, and the question of whether the warning was real answered itself. Greene's army was already deploying into line 400 yards from the tents. The opening went exactly the way Greene had drawn it on the map in his head. The Carolina militia, the men everyone expected to break first, stood in the open and poured fire into the advancing British, by some accounts, as many as 17 volleys, a steadiness that visibly rattled the regulars marching toward them. Then, on command, they peeled back through the second line and out of the fight, and the British, smelling the same easy route they'd been handed at Camden, pressed forward hard, straight into the Continental regulars waiting in the timber. The second line rose out of the timber and went in with the bayonet. These were not the amateurs of Camden. These were the Maryland and Virginia Continentals, men who had bled at Guilford Courthouse, who had marched and starved through the whole Southern campaign and come out the other side as some of the hardest infantry in the Continental Army. They crashed into the British center at a dead run. The 2 lines slammed together and fought at a distance measured in feet, then in inches. Musket butts, bayonets, men firing into faces and clubbing at each other in the smoke, neither side willing to give the ground. For a few unbearable minutes, the whole battle balanced on that one screaming, grinding seam in the woods. And then the British line did the thing British lines almost never did. It came apart. Regiments buckled, then broke, then ran. Stewart watches his center dissolve. The disciplined line he had formed at dawn is folding backward toward the tents, men flinging away packs and cartridge boxes, the whole position peeling open like wet paper. In that moment the battle was won, and Greene knew it. His ragged, half-amateur army had done the nearly impossible thing. It had shattered a British force in an open, standing fight, and then it stopped to loot. The American line swept into the British camp and found it spread out with everything a starving, half-clothed army dreams about: tents, food, and rum. Discipline simply evaporated. Militia and Continentals alike scattered among the baggage, breaking open stores, some of them drinking. And here is the part that's easy to condemn and hard to actually blame them for. These were not undisciplined men by nature. They were men who had been marching that campaign on empty stomachs and bare feet, some of them for months, in an army that never had enough of anything. Now the whole world had suddenly filled up with food, with shoes, with rum, with everything the war had denied them, laid out in neat rows and apparently abandoned. The pursuit that should have destroyed Stewart's army curdled into a mob picking through tents, and the clean victory sat there on the ground while the men who had earned it ate and drank. Greene would never fully forgive that camp. It cost him the one thing his whole Southern war had been built to avoid giving away: a beaten enemy allowed to stand back up. Stewart got minutes he had no right to get, and the two pieces of that battlefield you were told to hold in mind went to work. First, the brick house. British soldiers under Major Henry Sheridan threw themselves inside, barred the doors, and turned the thick-walled building into a fortress in the space of a few minutes. From its upper windows they rained musket fire down into the disordered Americans caught in the open camp. Greene rushed his light field guns forward to batter the walls, and the gun crews were shot down around their pieces, the cannon left stranded in the killing ground between the two armies. Then the Blackberry Thicket. Marjorie Banks had never left it. William Washington, seeing the crisis, hurled his reserve cavalry straight at the brambles to clear them out, and the Thorns did to a cavalry charge exactly what Thorns do. The horses tangled and floundered, and Marjorie Banks's men shot them down at point-blank range. Washington's own horse was killed under him. He was bayoneted, dragged out of the snarl of thorns and dying animals, and taken prisoner. His squadron, Greene's sharpest edge, was ruined against a hedge in a matter of minutes. Then Marjorie Banks did the thing that flipped the entire day over. He led his battalion out of the thicket in a cold, disciplined counterattack, drove into the flank of the scattered, looting Americans, and swept them back through the camp, recapturing the abandoned field guns as he went. Stewart pulled his broken regiments together around the brick house, and suddenly he had a line again. It was, by any honest account, one of the finest small feats of arms the British performed in the entire Southern War, and it was done by a man with perhaps 400 soldiers and a hedge of thorns. There is a grim footnote to it, though, the kind the war handed out constantly. Within weeks, the officer who single-handedly saved Stewart's army would be dead, carried off not by an American musket, but by fever in the same Carolina low country he had just fought so brilliantly to hold. The swamp took him where the rebels could not. Greene looked at what remained to him. His army was tangled in the enemy camp, bleeding, its cavalry arms smashed against the thicket, unable to crack the house. He had beaten the British army in the field and could not deliver the final blow, so he did the last disciplined thing left to a good commander. He called his men off and withdrew in good order, leaving Stewart standing on the contested ground. Close to 4,000 men had marched onto that field. When the burial parties and surgeons finished their count, well over 1,000 of them were dead, wounded, or missing. Roughly a quarter of every man present gone in the space of a few hours. Measured against the number of soldiers actually engaged, Eutaw Springs stands as one of the bloodiest battles of the whole Revolution. A casualty rate so steep that written into a novel, you'd assume the author had inflated it for effect. Think about what Nathanael Greene actually accomplished on that field, because the scoreboard hides it completely. He did not win the battle. He did not hold the ground. He did not capture the army in front of him, and by every rule a soldier is taught, he lost. And it did not matter in the slightest, because Greene had never been playing for the field. He was playing for the country underneath it, and Eutaw Springs was simply the last, cleanest expression of the only strategy he had ever used down there. He did not beat the British. He used them up. He traded ground he didn't need for casualties they couldn't replace. He lost battle after battle in the newspapers and won the entire South on the map. He made losing itself into the plan, and every hard-fought defeat left the British a few more men short and a little less able to hold what they had already taken. "We fight, get beat, rise, and fight again," he wrote of that campaign. And every time both sides rose, Britain had fewer men to rise with. That was the bill that came due at Eutaw Springs. Stewart held the field and then discovered he could not do anything with it. His army was too gutted to hold the interior it had supposedly just defended. Within days, he pulled back toward Charleston, abandoning the Carolina backcountry for good. It was the last major battle of the Revolution in the Deep South, and the British walked off it as the technical winners and the strategic losers. 6 weeks later, and a few hundred miles north, Cornwallis surrendered a whole army at Yorktown, and the southern strategy that Eutaw Springs had already hollowed out simply collapsed. The redcoats would spend the rest of the war penned inside Charleston until they finally sailed away in the closing days of 1782. Go looking for that battlefield today and you'll have to look underwater. Much of the ground where those men fought, looted, and died now lies beneath the waters of Lake Marion, drowned by a dam built a century and a half later. A quiet monument marks what's left of the shore. It's a fitting resting place for a battle that Britain won and could not keep, a victory that sank, along with an empire's hold on the Carolinas out of sight. That's the story. If you'd like more like it, subscribing is the simplest way to keep them coming, and a like helps the channel find new people. Mostly, though, I'm curious what stayed with you. The looting that threw away a clean victory, or the strange way a lost battle still cost Britain the Carolinas. I'd love to read where you land in the comments.